Hi, my name is Ashley Hobson. I'm an occupational therapist with Today's Therapy Solutions, and I am also currently working on my doctorate at the Health Science Center in Rehabilitation Sciences. Today I'm talking about adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences are any type of adversity a person experiences before the age of 18. This is a list of the most commonly agreed upon ACEs: physical, emotional, sexual abuse, um, abuse of drugs or alcohol within the home, incarceration of a household member, someone in the home with a mental illness, uh, domestic violence in front of children. So when a mother is treated violently in a home, a mother or father is treated violently in a home with one or no parents. So this includes children whose parents are divorced or who have been placed in foster care or have any type of separation from one of their primary caregivers. Also includes the death of a parent. Also emotional or physical neglect. Neglect is a big one as well. Um, Kaiser is the original uh, study. The Kaiser study in the 1990s was a decade-long study over ACEs, and it linked ACEs to a lot of the major health disparities that we see in America. They also included poverty as an ACE. So they had 10 ACE items, and poverty is um, typically also included in the list of ACEs when we look at studies when they define what they're including as an adverse experience. Uh, so the original study was done in the 90s into the 2000s and linked adverse childhood experiences from everything to decreased quality of life, depression, substance abuse, to a significantly shortened lifespan. And this is the ACE pyramid. The majority of studies are based on the number of ACEs a person experiences, and they will also include, sometimes they will also include the frequency and or duration of exposure to adversity, but almost always looking at the number of those 10 items a person has experienced. So we know that ACEs disrupt neurodevelopment, leading to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which leads to adoption of health risk behaviors, disease and disability, and ultimately early death. A person with an ACE score of 6 or more is positively correlated with a lifespan shortened by up to 20 years. In Oklahoma, we have an average ACE score of 4. Some of the major adversities children in Oklahoma face are poverty, divorce, abuse, and incarceration of a caregiver. When you begin to think of kids you work with, you can start to identify ACE exposures with, if you know the family has parents who are separated or divorced, if you know that the child has been in foster care, or if the family lives in poverty. So we can really start to link ACEs pretty quickly to some of the kiddos that we work with in our different environments. Okay, ACEs and development. Exposure to ACEs can disrupt neurodevelopment and alter the brain architecture, which is the foundation for all learning, behavior, and health. So we as therapists know that brain architecture is the foundation for all learning, behavior, and health. But what's concerning about ACEs is that the structures of the brain are actually different depending on the age of exposure, the amount of exposure. ACEs can cause anything from different gray to white matter ratio, enlarged hippocampus, and even in some severe cases, altered brainstem function. So ACEs have a wide-ranging impact on how they can affect the actual architecture of the brain. Early experiences can impair development, with the amount of adversity positively correlated with the odds of having a delay. So what that means is the more adversity a child experiences, the more likely they are to have a delay in either cognition, language, or social emotional development. Often it's more than one of these areas. So we know that trauma is not just something that children can just push through or get over. It's something that we really have to approach with the understanding that their brains are different. According to the AAP, they believe that a lot of attention deficits, emotional dysregulation, and oppositional behaviors in children may be rooted in ACEs and toxic stress. I work with a child. I started working with him when he was 3. I had a significant language delay, and he already had a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. Now he's 4, and about 8 months ago, we started kind of taking a trauma-informed approach, and he has been receiving speech therapy since before he was ever referred to occupational therapy. And now I think he was recently actually discharged from speech because he has really, really, his language has just exploded. And now he will actually talk with me about some of what we know is trauma in the home. So this child who was diagnosed probably before the age of 3 or close to the age of 3 actually has a significant history of trauma and could easily identify an ACE score of 4 without even asking any questions of caregivers. So just kind of considering the environment of kiddos and how we might even have some misdiagnoses related to ACEs. Impairment and dysfunction positively correlated with ACEs. These are all things that, all impairments that are really common in individuals with ACEs. Developmental delays, disruptive sensory processing differences, poor self-regulation and coping skills, language delays, play differences, memory difficulties, aggressive behavior, and a hyperactive stress response. These also happen to be a lot of common reasons that children are referred for therapy. There are also impairments and dysfunctions that are commonly correlated with other diagnoses. So ACEs can kind of get wrapped up in other diagnoses, and my concern is that we would accidentally overlook them, assuming the impairment and dysfunction is actually related to another diagnosis. We also know that children with disabilities are at an increased risk of abuse by a caregiver. So those are also things we need to consider when we have children referred with a disability, maybe displaying some of these impairments and dysfunctions. So several components or several things to consider when looking at ACEs are neuroplasticity, toxic stress, and resilience. So now we're going to kind of go over the 3 of those. Neuroplasticity, as therapists, we're familiar with neuroplasticity and the ability of the brain to change. And we know that the brain never loses its ability to change. But the brain does have the most neuroplasticity early in life. So this is a visual of neural connections, the first picture being shortly after birth, and then the middle picture being 3 to 5 years, and then 6 to 10 years. So the brain forms the most neural connections within the first 3 to 5 years of life. It also, from 5 to 10 or 12 years, goes through the process of pruning. So neural connections form based on a child's experiences, and then they're either refined and strengthened, or they die off, also depending on a child's experiences. So we as therapists work with children during critical periods of brain development and refinement. And while ACEs can negatively impact brain development, we can positively impact brain development. We have the ability to not necessarily have to undo this disorganized neural development. We can help prevent it and kind of combat it. So that's really exciting to think about as we consider our role as therapists working with children who have adverse experiences. This is another visual related to neuroplasticity, just showing the brain's ability to change in response to experiences and the amount of effort required for these changes to occur. So we can see that the least amount of effort is required to elicit change within the first 5 years, but really 10, 12 years through adolescence, the brain can be changed with less effort, and then into adulthood, it requires a lot more effort for the same amount of change. So toxic stress is the concept that healthy development can be derailed by excessive or prolonged activation of stress response systems in the body and brain. Toxic stress is prolonged activation in the absence of protective relationships. So children really need protective adult relationships to combat toxic stress. Toxic stress refers to the stress response and the effect of that stress response on the individual's body, not the stressful event itself. So you can have two individuals who experience the same amount of stress, and it could be toxic for one and not for the other. So adversity and toxic stress are really, really individualized. ACEs can cause toxic stress in children by disrupting brain architecture and other organ systems, and increase the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment for the duration of an individual's life. So just that fight or flight response, living in that place where learning is not possible. This is another visual of toxic stress, because not all stress is toxic. We know that there's positive stress. A certain amount of stress, which again, dependent on the individual, but a certain level of stress for everyone is healthy and can promote learning. We have positive stress, and then you have stress that's not necessarily positive, but tolerable. And it's easily buffered by supportive relationships. And then we have toxic stress, which is prolonged stress response, again, in the absence of that protective adult relationship. So what determines toxic stress? And it's a combination of individual biological responses, duration and intensity of the stressor, the timing of the stressor, and the context of the stressor. So is the toxic stress occurring during that critical period of development? Is the brain being wired to live in a state of fight or flight? Is the hippocampus going to be enlarged? Or do we have structures in the brain growing and forming based on this toxic stress? And then context of the stressor. Is is who is supposed to be the child's primary caregiver or protective relationship, are they causing or allowing the toxic stress? So can be really hard when children are, for example, children who are abused by one parent and the other doesn't stop it. That can be extremely stressful. The child feels attacked by one parent and in a way attacked by the other because they're not protected. This is a visual of toxic stress and brain architecture. The top is normal brain development, normal neural connections, and then the bottom, which is cut off, is the neural connections whenever there's a severe neglect, is what these two are looking at. So normal development and toxic stress in the form of severe neglect. The other component when we're looking at ACEs, and we talked about neuroplasticity and toxic stress, and now looking at resilience and the interaction between biology and environment that builds a child's ability to cope with adversity and overcome threats to healthy development. So as school therapists, we have the ability to take on the role of fostering resilience so that children can overcome the toxic stress that prevents them from participating in the school environment. We're going to look at that a little bit. These are factors that counterbalance adversity and promote resilience. Number one, facilitating supportive adult-child relationships. The supportive adult-child relationship is the greatest indicator of developing resilience. And that's why it's listed in toxic stress. In the definition of toxic stress, it says that prolonged stress in the absence of this supportive adult-child relationship. So the number one way we counterbalance adversity is the adult-child relationship. Building a sense of self-advocacy and perceived control, providing opportunities to strengthen adaptive skills and self-regulatory capacities, then mobilizing sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. And these are all roles that are within our scope of practice and things that we do, whether or not we're working with children who experience adversity, but these are ways we foster resilience in almost all the children that we work with. So right in line with our role as therapists is fostering resilience for children with a history of adversity. This is just a quick visual of how we develop resilience, how resilience overcomes adversity. The positive has to outweigh the negative. So looking at all of that, now let's look at trauma-informed schools. So we know that trauma or adversity can impact school performance. It can impair learning and can lead to feelings of distress throughout the school day. Some of the things that adversity and trauma are linked with: a decreased GPA, increased number of absences or an increased dropout rate, decreased reading ability, decreased attention at school, decreased memory and cognition, difficulty focusing and problem solving, poor emotional control, impulsive behavior, and a wide range of sensory processing differences that may lead a child to be perceived as defiant or oppositional. And these are the different sections of where adversity and trauma can affect a child in the school environment. With relationship development and maintenance, it can lead to dysfunctional attachment patterns. A lot of these children do not have secure attachment patterns with a primary caregiver. And that kind of lays the foundation for healthy attachment and relationship development. So again, not having a really good foundation for developing meaningful relationships within the school environment. Sensory processing may come out as tactile defensiveness or sensory seeking or avoiding, poor tone and coordination, then interoceptive system difficulties, issues. Self-regulation is often impaired. Might look at like non-compliance, impulse control, or difficulty with behavior modification. Areas in social skills that adversity and trauma can affect: social regulation, empathy, turn-taking, sharing, joining in play, and conflict resolution. All of the social skills that children use at school, they typically start to develop at home. And if they cannot develop, if they don't have an example of this or someone encouraging this, they can't be at home seeing conflict resolution as physical violence and then come to school and just automatically know that conflict resolution at school and with friends looks different. And language delay is extremely common in children with adversity. And then difficulty with sequence of time. If you don't have any type of predictability or routine or control over your environment, it's really hard to develop that understanding, that sequence. And we have to have that understanding as we start working with kiddos that if they have experience of adversity or trauma, they might interpret information differently. So relationship development and maintenance. Many children spend most of their waking hours outside of the home. Therefore, relationships that form with young children in centers and schools have the power to set the trajectory of a child's life. So these kiddos do not often understand the basic social norms that we have because they're not getting it at home. Their behavior does not always serve the function it appears to serve to us. And a lot of the time we'll actually see some pretty inconsistent behavioral responses in response to the same stimuli or antecedent. So just having a lot of inconsistency, a lot of disorganization in how they process everything. So trauma-informed related services, how we can have a role with the relationships, connecting with children, communicating acceptance, creating and fostering healthy boundaries, tone of voice and body language, eye contact and playful engagement, finding ways to say yes, inviting dependence, and sameness. So connecting with children and communicating acceptance, that directly relates to the primary indicator of developing resilience, which is the supportive adult relationship. So just being there and being present with that child and allowing the child to know that they're accepted and their behavior at times might not be appropriate, or how they're interacting with others might not be appropriate, but their feelings are valid, and just communicating that they're accepted regardless of having things to overcome. Healthy boundaries, because a lot of children do not have healthy boundaries in the home environment if they're experiencing abuse or neglect. Just being aware that tone of voice and body language, kids with trauma may be more sensitive to those differences. So it being something we have put conscious effort into being aware of. Finding ways to say yes, because a lot of these kids don't have any control or opportunities to make choices in the home environment. And then inviting dependence. And this goes to also overlaps with developing self-regulation. We know that children, very young children, infants and young children, have to be able to co-regulate with an adult before they can self-regulate. And a lot of the time, children with abuse or neglect are not they're not able to co-regulate with an adult. Or maybe if with mental illness present in the home, the adult is not able to be there and support the child and co-regulate with the child. So while our goal is to help children become independent, they also need to know that they can depend on us. And then sameness is just, we all want to have things in common with each other. And we all, when you're spending time with someone and you're connecting with someone, it really helps foster that relationship when you can find things in common. Sensory processing. Very, very important. Sensory rich environments are essential for kids with a history of trauma. Thinking about poverty and a lot of neglectful environments, children are not getting the sensory rich experiences that typically developing children are. So really making sure that those kids get that stimulation, get those opportunities, and then having environments that support sensory integration, because that promotes self-regulation. And these are just a few areas where we can do that. Morning arrival, group time, meal times, and nap times. Therapists are a great resource for teachers to have as to how to incorporate and meet sensory needs within those settings. Also, because these are times of transition, and transitions can be very difficult for kiddos with a history of trauma. Self-regulation. This is quite the list of different ways we can help foster self-regulation. A lot of strategies for whether it's self-soothing or managing emotions, working memory, teaching compensatory skills or sustained attention, encouraging cognitive flexibility, developing behavioral self-regulation, teaching behavioral control, handling non-compliance, teaching impulse control, and teaching behavior modulation. Two that come to mind that I use with a young girl I work with. She's 6 now, and she was adopted out of foster care when she was 3 years old, and she had been in foster care. She went into foster care due to neglect in the home, and in the 18 months she was in foster care, I believe it was, she went to 9 different homes, and I can't remember the exact number, but their social work has said that each time a child is moved between homes and foster care, it delays development. So her parents are wonderful and do trust-based relationship intervention, I believe, and they introduced me to the concept of compromising. So what might be perceived as non-compliance is just a grasp for any type of control. So sure, we can offer that. You might not be able to choose everything, but let's compromise. I said 5 minutes, you want 7, let's 6 minutes, we're going to work for 6 minutes and then we can take a break. That's a fair compromise. So finding ways to compromise and show that you don't have to have the final say for every single thing. You care about them and you're willing to compromise with them. And then another one is do-overs. So, impulse control, and, a lot of kiddos, even if they know what they need to do, it's just, their reaction is so quick that by the time they can stop and think about it, they've already done what they're not supposed to. And so instead of an immediate consequence, just, do you want a do-over? Do you want an opportunity to redo um, something the right way or the way you're supposed to? And offering that's just another way to really show that trust and respect to them. Social skills, empathy, turn taking, sharing, joining in play, conflict resolution, and apologizing. They're all ones that might be really, common. We feel like common sense, but things kids struggle with. I was speaking with an adult who had a very dysfunctional home environment growing up, and he told me that social norms were not normal for him. And even as an adult, sometimes he will do or say things that he does not intend to be insulting or inappropriate. He just feels like there are some things he just does not understand, and he feels out of place because he knows that he can kind of catch on to that people don't agree with it or something. And but it's just not something he grew up learning. Conflict resolution was not a thing. It was explosive in his home, conflict, and then everybody would explode at one another and then ignore it. So those are all things he felt like he had to actively learn. So we need to kind of just have that awareness that we can't assume a child not following social norms or not displaying the social skills we would expect for their age. We can't assume what they do or don't know. And then looking at the developmental processes and learning, we must identify developmental milestones that are only partially met or completely missed altogether. We as therapists are in a great place to do that with helping teachers identify missed milestones, and then we can foster development of these milestones and help kids achieve them, or help teachers put things into place to help develop these skills in the classroom. Common milestones that are missed: curiosity, autonomy, object constancy and object permanence, body integrity, symbolic thinking, language delay, and sequence of time. So when the child is living the majority of their life, home life, in a state of fight or flight, the brain is not in a place to learn, and the child might not even feel safe to explore. Curiosity might be something they are scared to do, because if you are scared in your environment, it's not really something you want to explore. Or if you're living in poverty, there might not be much to explore. And then with the physical environment, things to consider: neutral colors, or subtle or no patterns on the floor, wall space that's not overstimulating. We want to create a sensory neutral physical environment, and then provide sensory rich experiences is really the concept. We can't be sure what might be a trigger for a child related to a physical environment, or even when you think about lavender, for example, being a calming, something we typically associate with calming. If it's linked to a traumatic experience for a child, it might be something that sends that child into a fight or flight response. So, children might not always be able to tell us that either. So we just have to be able to really know the kids that we're working with and individualize it to what they need. And then organization of time, setting a leisurely pace, providing predictability, visual cues, time for child-directed activities, shortened teacher-directed activities, minimizing the number of transition and providing a lot of opportunities for outdoor play. The same behavior strategies we might use for kids without trauma, a lot of them are very effective and appropriate for children with trauma. And then approaches to learning. Play-based environments are healing for children with a history of trauma. Kids learn through play, and it can really help kids work through that trauma. A musical climate. There are actually studies that have shown with kiddos who have have brainstem impairments or disorganization that rhythmic music helped to organize and promote function in the brainstem, so it can help overcome that brainstem trauma. Language-rich environments that foster play and language development, because language impairments are one of the most common and most severe impairments that kids with adversity experience. And then errorless learning and conceptually rich curriculum. Here are two great resources that I think are very helpful, and just kind of, I've taken both of these for myself just to know that there's the ACE questionnaire and the resilience questionnaire, and you can get your ACE score and then your resilience score. And those are also just really helpful tools to have on hand as we're kind of thinking about individuals that we're working with and better understanding them and maybe where they're at. Really quickly, we do know that ACEs, adults asked about their adverse experiences as children typically underreport a little bit their ACE score, because and it makes sense, because growing up, what you experience at home is your normal, and so what is adversity or trauma was normal, and so a lot of adults with a history of trauma have underreport their ACE score by 1 or 2 items. And then unfortunately, research has shown a discrepancy between self-reported ACE score and caregiver-reported ACE score. So caregivers of individuals with a history of ACEs are going to further underreport the ACE score. So it's because it's not an openly stated adverse experience. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, and that's just also something to keep in mind. And then the Center on the Developing Child has some wonderful resources for adverse experiences, ways professionals can support caregivers of children and promote the adult-child relationship, has great resources for brain architecture and toxic stress and resilience. And that link there will take you to the main site, and then you can kind of gather resources from all of those things there. And then you can't do questions through recording, but I hope this presentation has been helpful. And I will be sending out an email with some additional resources for ACEs and some of the topics discussed today. And I am happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability through email as well. Thank you so much.